Welcome back. Welcome back. This week, a leading think tank, Chatham House, warned that Iraq was facing the distinct possibility of collapse and fragmentation if there's not a radical change in strategy. No longer, they said, is there just one civil war in Iraq, but many, and the government has become powerless in much of the country. Now, a man who was once at the centre of the Iraqi government is Ali Allawi. He's been a senior advisor to the Prime Minister of Iraq, as well as Iraq's Minister of Defence and of Finance. His new book, a good solid tome here, is called The Occupation of Iraq, Winning the War, Losing the Peace. Your analysis is somewhat similar to the state of Iraq, to that given by Chatham House, isn't it? You said a year to go to the bottom point?
I mean, I think so. The report from Chatham House, was written quite recently, and this book was based on the events of the last 4 years, but it drove me really to the same conclusion that they reached, in the sense that if there isn't a radical shift in policy, especially in the United States, you're unlikely to have the kind of acceptable outcome in Iraq, and it will not necessarily lead to a failed state, but it will lead to a state or a government that's unable to exercise its authority over the entirety of the land of Iraq. And
that's happening at the moment, they say.
It's happening at the moment, yes. I mean, the government's threat really doesn't extend very far. Most of the security is provided by the United States through the MNF, the multinational force. The Iraqi army is not really up to the task of maintaining security over the entire country. The rest of the country that comes sort of under the government's aegis, which is the majority Shia parts, that's the south of the country in Baghdad. There, I think security is provided primarily by political parties and local groups and militias.
And when you say changes of policy, one thing specifically you say that we're all used to hearing about the green zone, the safe area in the centre of Baghdad and so on, but you say that's got to go.
I think so. I mean, the green zone is actually symptomatic of the problems of Iraq. I mean, it disconnects the government from the realities outside, and it creates a kind of bubble mentality. And the more it becomes fortified, fortress-like, the more people who are involved in government want to be located there. And in time, I think you become completely disconnected with the rest of the country. And in fact, the rest of the country sees you as a kind of alien element sitting behind concrete barriers.
And when you say other things, particularly in the US, have got to change, and indeed in the coalition, so therefore including the UK as well, but what are the main changes, apart from the green zone? What's the main thing that's got to happen, however difficult?
Well, I mean, the United States really has not changed the fundamental aspects of its policy since the beginning of the war, and that is to try to push for a military solution by either strengthening the central government and giving it a kind of national unity gloss, and at the same time trying to use the multinational force to impose the authority or the writ of the Americans and of the government on the rest of Iraq. But that has patently failed for a variety of reasons. I mean, Iraq has become far more fragmented. Now there are a large number of countervailing forces around the country, militias and other groups, and of course the insurgency and Al-Qaeda. The military aspect of it cannot be resolved unless you perhaps double or even triple the forces there, which is outside of the realm of the possible given the state of American domestic politics.
How much of a democracy is Iraq at the moment?
I think we have the forms of democracy in the sense that we have elections and we have a constitution that was ratified by a referendum. It is an incomplete democracy. The contents are not there. The spirit of democracy is not there. The forms of democracy are there, and political parties, which are sort of the expression of democratic politics, function. But there are no elements inside the structures of government that provide for countervailing forces. I mean, the judiciary, although independent, is extremely weak and cannot stand up to the executive authority. Parliament is, to some extent, a plaything of the major political parties and doesn't have kind of status of its own. So it's a very, very weak and fragile democracy.
Weak and fragile democracy, but it started.
It started, and I think and it is unlikely to be reversed, which is one of the few positive effects of this war, is that it has Iraq, which used to be run as an authoritarian entity, various degrees of dictatorship, leading to the tyranny of the last 20 years of Saddam and the Ba'ath Party. That form of government, I think, has been overthrown permanently. What's going to replace it, whether chaos or dismemberment or the beginnings of a functioning democracy, is the issue. But at least I don't think we'll go back to the kind of authoritarian dictatorial rule that we had in the past.
And you said that in the book, you said that there's a human resources deficit in Iraq at the moment. They need people like you, don't they? Are you going to go back?
Yes, I mean, I'll go back. I mean, I live outside the green zone, so my own personal security is more compromised, as it were, if I were to live inside the green zone. I had about 150 people who acted as my guards and bodyguards while I was a minister. Now I only have about 8. So living outside of the green zone with a very limited security detail is not really a recipe for long-term survival in Baghdad these days. So I have to be very cautious. But I intend to go back, yes, in the near future.
Well, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Good luck with the book, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And now, we're told that we should learn the lessons of history. We were always told that. But can anyone or anything prepare us for the rare but seismic events which sometimes mark the history of mankind? Could anyone have predicted 9/11, for example, the Asian tsunami, or the outbreak of the First World War? The essayist and professor of statistics, NASSIM Nicholas Taleb, believes these events will always take us by surprise, and that historians and philosophers concoct explanations after the events to make it look as though they were in fact predictable. Mr. Taleb is joining us now from New York. There he is. And
hi.
Hi there. And with me here in the studio is Constantine Sandis, lecturer in philosophy at Oxford Brookes University here in the UK.
Hi.
Welcome. Coming quickly, first of all, to the two basic things. Randomness, which is at the heart of your first book and is continued in a sense in your second book, and the black swan. Can you, just for our viewers, explain those two in a couple of paragraphs before we go on?
The black swan, what I call the black swan, is an event that's an exception. Just like for a long time we thought that all swans were white, and then of course after the discovery of Australia we figured out that, hey, all swans were not all white, that there was that exception, that bird. But what I call a black swan is an event that has 3 properties. Number one, it's completely unexpected, and just like the black swan, you had no reasons to believe that it couldn't take place. No rational reasons. The second one, it carries massive consequences. And the third one, which is the most vicious, is that before the fact, it's unpredictable. After the fact, we figure out theories and so on to explain its occurrence and to show that there was causality, that we understood what was going on, but effectively we couldn't predict it. So to me, these black swan dominate the world, and not just historical events, it's linked. Economic events, technologies, the internet, the laser, the computer, Google, September 11, the first war. These events were effectively unpredicted, of course. After the fact, you may find some exceptions, someone who in the shower predicted something similar, but effectively, if you take cohorts of people at the time, you'll realize that they were not predicted.
But just to take an example, say the Second World War, I mean, yes. Winston Churchill had been predicting that for 5 years. It wasn't a sudden, unpredictable event. It was totally measured. There was world debate on it.
After the fact, if you look at history, you will find the documents, the selection of documents, everything makes events look a lot more linear, a lot more have a lot more causal chains, causal links. But when you're actually standing, in Germany in the 30s, it's very hard to see what was going to happen.
What do you think about that, Constantine?
One thing I was trying to understand from your book is how random these events are meant to be. I mean, normally when we talk of random events, we mean things that are unplanned or they don't have intentions behind them and so on. And it seemed weird to me to have events that include human actions to say that they're random, as in there was no intention behind them or plan behind them, whether it's 9/11 or the First or the Second World War. So I wasn't sure if I'd quite grasped your concept of random.
As a scientist, the way we define randomness, and it's quite critical, there's no such thing as pure randomness. What is random to me is what I cannot predict. So if I see a pregnant lady walking down the street, the sex of her child is a random variable for me, but not to her doctor. Likewise, when you go to a casino, it's not random. We call it a random event, and a casino is not random. However, our knowledge is not good enough to be able to predict what the roulette wheel is going to do, or when you flip a coin, whether it's going to turn head or tail. So effectively, randomness comes from incomplete information and inability to predict the next step. That's my functional definition of randomness. It's pretty much a scientific consensus of how we look at it.
Does that mean that, for instance, all those phrases that we were taught at school about the fact that history repeats itself, and if we don't analyze the ways in which history repeats itself, it will happen all over again? I mean, is that bunkum as far as you're concerned?
No, not completely. Effectively, what my whole book is about is a roadmap of how to deal with in a world with a world we don't fully understand, and what are the soft spots. Effectively, we can learn something from history. We just cannot blindly look at history as something that delivers, as a machine that delivered to us all its answers. You have to be skeptical about how you learn from history or what you can learn from history. So in my book, I have a catalog of where my whole idea is not to be a sucker, because, you know, not to be fooled by historical events, not to be fooled into believing that we can predict more than we can.
Constantine.
I must say, I really like the stuff about predictability in your book. What I wasn't sure about was that you seem to think there was a kind of symmetry between unpredictability and inexplicability after the event. And I wasn't quite sure how that came about. So you might think, well, we can't predict things, and maybe even after the event, we can't, maybe it is wrong to think that we could have predicted them before. But that's not necessarily to say that we can't explain now why these things occurred.
For me, there's a very simple metric to test our current understanding of events, is if we can really gauge the proper share of causes and consequences, is effectively if we can predict what's going to happen tomorrow. To me, what I said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and the proof of knowledge is in how it explains what happens outside it's the sample in which it was derived. In other words, if you understand economic life today, you should be able to tell me what's going to happen tomorrow. If you can't, then you have to accept that we don't quite understand.
Thank you both very much indeed. Oh, by the way, Nassim, could you predict for us the name of the next president of the United States?
That my whole book is about how to live in a world in which we really can't predict these things. But someone had been joking and told me, well, it's going to be the black swan.
Perfect. Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. Join me in a moment when I'll be joined by actor, Hollywood star, writer Gene Wilder, and by musician Hugh Masekela. We've got rhythm for you, all after the news.